Okay, just imagine this for a second. You get the most powerful job in the entire Western world, a job you're supposed to have for life, an appointment from God himself. And what do? You walk away. Well, that's the incredible story we're diving into today, the Pope who quit. So where do we even begin? How about with a famous mystery from one of the greatest books ever written? In his masterpiece, The Inferno, the poet Dante describes this place at the very entrance to hell. It's kind of like a waiting room for souls who weren't evil enough to be truly damned, but were too cowardly to do the right thing. And he sees one soul in particular who's there for making the great refusal. So who is this mystery person? For centuries, most scholars have been pretty sure Dante was talking about a pope, of all people, Pope Celestine V. Now that sounds crazy, right? A holy man, a pope, being called a coward? To understand why, we've got to go all the way back to the year 1292. The Catholic Church was in the middle of a serious crisis. And this is where our main character enters the stage. A guy who wanted absolutely nothing to do with the world, who suddenly gets the biggest job in it. Think about this. For 26 months, that's more than 2 years, there was no pope. The job was just empty. The cardinals, the men who are supposed to pick the next one, were completely deadlocked, caught up in their own political family drama. The entire church had basically ground to a halt, and things were getting chaotic. And then, out of absolutely nowhere, something wild happens. A letter shows up. It's from this 80-year-old hermit named Pietro del Morrone, who's literally living in a cave. And he's writing to the most powerful men in the church, telling them to get their act together and pick a pope or face God's punishment. I mean, the sheer nerve of this guy. So what do the cardinals do? In maybe one of the most bizarre political moves in history, they decide to elect the guy who just yelled at them. They figured, hey, this old hermit is super holy, he doesn't care about politics. He'll be the perfect puppet for us to control. And, well, they were about to find out they were kind of right and also very wrong. So who was this guy really? Pietro was the absolute opposite of a powerful church politician. His entire life was built around rejecting worldly power. This was a man who spent decades, living in a mountain cave just so he could pray and be alone with God. He had zero interest in ruling over anyone. And this next scene, it just perfectly captures the whole problem. He rides into the city for his coronation on a donkey, a symbol of humility, right? Just like Jesus. But look who's walking right next to him. 2 kings, the king of Naples and the king of Hungary, already trying to get their claws into him. This man of simple faith had just walked straight into the lion's den. So he's now Pope Celestine V. How do you think it went? Let's just say this whole experiment went downhill fast. You know, there's a quote from a play about his life that just nails the kind of culture shock he must have felt. He came from a life of prayer and poverty, and he was dropped right into the papal court, which was dripping with wealth and drowning in political games. It was like he'd landed on another planet. He was just completely, totally unprepared for the job. He knew nothing about church law or finances or diplomacy. He was apparently horrified by all the paperwork and the backroom deals, calling it all filth. He was so easy to manipulate that the King of Naples convinced him to create a whole new batch of cardinals, mostly French guys, which ended up shifting the balance of power in the church for almost 100 years. And if you want to know just how miserable he was, listen to this. This detail is just heartbreaking. For him, being pope wasn't a position of power. It was a prison. He got so desperate for his old life of solitude that he actually had a little wooden hut built, a replica of his cave, inside the enormous lavish papal palace, just so he could have a place to hide and feel like a hermit again. So after just 5 months, he was done. He knew he couldn't go on. He had to get out. But there was one massive, unprecedented problem. I mean, seriously, how do you do that? No pope had ever done it before. There was no procedure, no rule book. The pope was supposed to be the pope until he died, period. Quitting just wasn't an option. So Celestine had to do something absolutely revolutionary. Before him, the whole idea of a pope resigning was, well, it was just a theory. Something for church lawyers to debate. There was no actual formal process for a pope to just hang up his hat and walk away. This part is just incredible. He got some lawyers together, including, ironically, the man who would take his job, and he issued an official papal decree, a brand new law that said for the very first time, a pope had the right to resign. He literally had to invent his own escape hatch. And just 1 week later, on December 13th, 1294, he used it. Now, You'd think that's the end of the story, right? The old hermit finally gets to go back to his mountain cave happily ever after. But no, the story takes a much darker and much more tragic turn. You see, his successor, the guy who became Pope Boniface VIII, was a brilliant lawyer, but he was also deeply paranoid. He knew that as long as Celestine, now just Pietro Morrone again, was out there and free, he was a huge liability. Boniface's enemies could just kidnap the old man, declare him the real pope, and start a massive civil war within the church. So Boniface ordered him detained. The old hermit tried to flee. He was actually trying to get to Greece, but he was captured. Boniface had the 81-year-old man locked up in a grim castle prison. And just 9 months later, Pietro Morrone died in that cell. And then, in a final, stunning twist of irony, a few years after that, the church declared him a saint. And this brings us right back to our original mystery. Was Celestine the coward Dante wrote about, a man who ran away from his sacred duty and let the ruthless Boniface take over? Or was he something else entirely? Another famous poet, Petrarch, writing a little later, saw things completely differently. He argued that what Celestine did wasn't weakness, but strength. For Petrarch, Celestine's decision was the ultimate act of self-knowledge and courage. Here was a man who was honest enough to recognize his own limitations, who understood he was unfit for the office, and who chose to save his own soul instead of clinging to worldly power. To Petrarch, that wasn't shirking a duty. It was a profound act of humility. And so, his legacy is still completely torn. Was he a saint who chose humility over power? A man whose name is still linked to an annual festival of forgiveness? Or was he the soul Dante saw at the gates of hell, damned forever for making the great refusal? It's amazing. He was a man who only wanted solitude, but his brief, chaotic 5 months in power left a mark on history that we're still debating over 700 years later.